I am Anna Seewald, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about personal development in the context of parenting, where I explore how you can find more calm, connection, and joy in parenting through the process of self-discovery and inner growth with a trauma-informed lens. I'm a parent educator, and my mission is to help children by helping parents. The motto of this podcast is raising our children, growing ourselves. Today, simplicity parenting, how to build deeply connected families in the culture of too much, too soon, too fast by focusing on doing less, simplifying our children's lives, environments, toys, schedules, establishing predictable routines, and creating balance and harmony. On this episode, we talk about the challenges of the pandemic life, remote learning, and excessive screen time. We emphasize the importance of downtime, the power of play, and creativity. My special guest for this episode is the author of a best-selling book, Simplicity Parenting, using the extraordinary power of less to raise calmer, happier, and more secure kids. Kim John Payne. He's a consultant and trainer to over 230 U.S. independent and public schools. He regularly gives keynote addresses at international conferences for educators, parents, and therapists, and runs workshops and trainings around the world. Kim is the director of the Simplicity Project, a multimedia social network that explores what really connects and disconnects us to ourselves and to the world. Together with his team, they have trained around 1,000 simplicity parenting coaches around the world. Kim is the founding director of the Center for Social Sustainability, an organization that has trained thousands of teachers, parents, and educators and students in the three-stream process that gives social, emotional, and behavioral support to children who struggle in the school environment. In addition to Simplicity Parenting, he has also authored The Games Children Play and The Soul of Discipline, and he has co-authored several other books. His books have been translated into 27 languages. Kim John Payne has appeared frequently on television, including ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, on radio with the BBC, Sirius XM, CBC, and NPR, and in print, including being featured in Time Magazine, Chicago Tribune, Parenting, Mothering, Times Union, and the LA Times. Please enjoy this deep, insightful, and inspirational conversation with Kim John Payne. Well, Kim, welcome to Authentic Parenting. It is my deepest honor and pleasure to have you on the show today.
Oh, it's lovely to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
Your name has been on my black book, as many other guests have called it. Since I started the podcast, I keeping a log, a name of guests, dream guests that I want to have on this podcast. Your name has been in that list since the beginning. And I guess I never had the courage to reach out, or maybe the timing wasn't right. But now I'm happy we're speaking. So after 6 years, I couldn't be happier to have you on this podcast.
Oh, that's lovely. It is. It's lovely to receive the invitation, Anna.
I think I read your first book, Simplicity Parenting, before even I had my daughter. I can't remember, but it completely turned my thinking upside down and changed me as a person, as a professional, and of course, as a parent. And I tried my best to follow the principles of the simplicity parenting in my work and in my home. But I think your work in terms of the simplicity parenting, more than ever now, is so vital and important. The message that you share. I mean, we live in this crazy, overwhelmed, high stress environment. Before I ask you some questions, I would love to know, what has been your pandemic experience? How have you coped? What are you missing about the pre-pandemic life?
Yes, in the before times, as I've heard it described. Oh, and the after times. Oh my. Yeah, like everyone, there was almost like a shock that around February, March, that I think the world received. It was almost like Mother Nature has sent us to our rooms to consider our behavior and is saying, you may not come out until you realize what you've been doing and change your ways. That's how it affected me. I felt like I was a part of a large, just being sent to our rooms to consider what we've been doing to the planet, what we've been doing to our families, what the pace of life, the overwhelm, has been doing to us all. And yeah, for me, it was very, very similar to everyone else. My work personally shifted from traveling all around, to many different places in the world, and it shifted to, as so many people did, to online. Although my wife is an elementary school teacher, and so she continued on, in-person classes, and they built all these outdoor classrooms. And I live in New England in the United States, and it gets awfully cold here. But they just continued on. I so admire the ingenuity of educators and the dedication of educators. I've come to even, hold them in greater regard than I already did. So, for me, perhaps the biggest change was the explosion of inquiries to my private family counseling practice that came in. And, understandably, of course, parents really looking for support. And so that side of things has really changed for me. But I guess, like a lot of people, we went through phases. And the first phase was that almost of disbelief that this was happening. And then a very, very quick adjustment, like, how are we going to figure this out? If the kids are going to be at home, what are we going to do? And there was just a lot of energy exuded, tremendous amounts of, I would talk with parents, and again, the admiration of how parents could be so ingenious in what they were doing in the face of this. And that lasted several months. And then we got into a bit of a rhythm. Many parents got into a little bit of a rhythm, albeit a strange old one, because schools would go back and then they would close again. Then there would be hybrid, and it was very hard to adjust. But we got into a strange sort of rhythm. What I'm seeing now in the new year, though, is a little bit of burnout, that all that energy we exuded to try and cope with this is now, taking its toll. And even though there's, to some degree, light at the end of the tunnel, we're told, I'm experiencing in family life a good degree of low energy, of it's more difficult now. And with my care professional colleagues also being on the front lines of this, also a good degree of just feeling burnt out, little bit heading in that direction at least. Yeah.
I completely agree with you. I see the same pattern. I think, I don't want to be pessimistic, but it seems like we have reached a tipping point. You said it well. I felt it the same way. In summertime, at least, I was very mobilized, resourceful, happy, and it seems like I mobilized all my energy, and then I have nothing else left, right? At some point, your internal resources get depleted. And, this reminds me of my experience with an earthquake. I was born and raised in Armenia. In 1988, a severe earthquake happened in my hometown. It was the epicenter, and everything was, ruined, and people were killed. And it was a huge disaster, this global countrywide disaster. And I was 13 years old, and my daughter is 13 now. And it's a very interesting time for me to be in this experience and draw parallels between what I went through with that experience. And it's, of course, with the earthquake, the destruction is more visible. Everything is ruined, and the buildings are no longer there. People's lives are no longer there. But with the pandemic, the loss, the grief, I think the overwhelm, the pace of life, everything, the change, the uncertainty, the fear is all the same. And the globalness of it, the massiveness of it, that everybody's going through this same experience, I see it very similar to what I went through.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, Anna, because what I see happening is there's been some families, some parents who have certainly felt the effects of this, but if they were living a fairly simple life, in other words, they weren't rushing the kids from place to place to place and had a very high velocity life, and they had a lot of time at home anyway for the children to decompress, which is a major principle of simplicity parenting, is giving children a childhood, frankly, as embarrassing almost as it is to say that. But yeah, the parents who had a life full of that, just where there were safety release valves for the kids when they'd come home from school, they weren't overdoing it. And they had a real, because of that, they just had time, time to make connection. Connection really does take time, of course. And for those families, it was almost like they built the family ark before the social flood. And it's been a testament to the conscious parenting that quite a lot of families, given the tragedy of the loss of life and all that we know about this pandemic, and almost every parent prefaces this statement by saying that, or they all do, they've actually, many parents actually have loved this time, have gotten closer to their kids, it's caused a certain sort of reevaluation. And I'm hearing from a lot of parents that now that schools are starting to go back, they certainly are back in other countries. My colleagues in Australia and New Zealand, schools are pretty much back there as they were, obviously with some distancing and masking and so on in many environments, but they're back. But the parents are really questioning, do we want to go back to that pace of life again? We feel more connected to our kids, even though it got intense and crazy sometimes. We've really forged a deeper connection. We realize what time together can do. And whilst we maybe don't want that much time, as and being forced upon us, it's very interesting how many parents now are questioning what they will do and making some pretty conscious decisions about. We are not going to get back into the sports travel teams with the intensity we were. We're not going to have as many ballet classes, soccer practices, after school play dates, like multiple. We're just going to dial that back because we've got a baseline of what it feels like to be connected. And we don't want to lose that connection. So that's been somewhat of the unexpected gift, for want of a better word, of these times we're living in.
Yeah, I think you're an optimist. It sounds to me that you're more optimistic than I am at this point. I was more optimistic in the beginning. but my lens has shifted for some reason. Yeah, I do appreciate that people had more time to slow down finally once in their lifetime, a lot of parents. And in the beginning, I have a friend who couldn't sit still for a moment. She didn't know what to do with all of this time. And people needed a little bit of time to recalibrate, right, to the new pace of life. And it brought a lot of gifts, a lot of thinking about the priorities. I do completely get that. But there are downsides as well of being too close together, too much, getting on each other's nerves under there. Kids are on top of each other, parents getting annoyed. Screen time has increased significantly in a lot of households, even people who had limited screen time. My family, for example, it has changed tremendously because school is done through school. After that, there is entertainment, connection. Again, everything is through screens. And, I'm wondering, there are good parts and bad parts, but I would love for you to talk about how can parents simplify? Why simplify in the first place anyways? Now that a lot of parents see the benefits, how can they maintain this lifestyle with some good principles that you teach moving forward and keeping the best parts of this pandemic?
Yeah, good question. What I've seen firsthand, because I speak with parents. I've already spoken with two parents before our conversation today, and I'll speak with a bunch of others afterwards. And I'm hearing stories from around the world, also because we have over 1,000 Simplicity parenting coaches and group leaders around the world that we've trained. So the information that we get back, the feedback we get back, is very cross-cultural. So it's not just Euro or US centric by any means. The thing that I'm noticing is that the principles that Simplicity parenting has been founded on seem to have come more sharply into focus during this time. Because interestingly enough, where the journey of this began for me was I was working in a group home for abused teenagers, and also with gang rescue when I was just quite a young guy, really. I was just in college, and I was studying during the day and then working in the evenings in this group home. And I noticed that there was a very strong correlation between the classes I was taking that were talking about combat veterans who weren't doing very well. And way back then in the late 70s, that was called trauma response, or it had various names, but the term PTSD hadn't come into common usage quite yet. And I approached the professor, particularly one very wonderful professor, approached him and said, you're talking about combat veterans who are not doing so well, but I'm thinking of the kids in my group home who show pretty much the same behaviors. I said to him, you're talking about combat veterans who are really struggling with over-controlling their environment, like hyper-controlling their families, their partners, their workplace. Very difficult for them to be employed because they would push back against any authority. They wanted to exert control. And I said, that's so similar to the kids in my group home, many of them. And he was talking about hypervigilance, never being able to quite relax, scanning a room, not really sitting in it. And I said, boy, I could show you, half a dozen kids tomorrow who do exactly that, but they're not combat veterans. And then he was talking about rejecting novelty, in other words, newness, pushing back against anything new, and kind of getting into very cyclical, almost obsessive, like cycling round and round and round. And again, I said, I could show you a whole bunch of kids in my group home who are behaving exactly like that. And it was even down to some practical things, Anna, like night terrors. And again, I said to him, if you were to come to my group home in the evening at nighttime, you would hear the corridors just lit up with screaming and shouting and crying, and it's just the same. So he did come to my group home, because I kept saying to him, and he was very influential in my life in the sense that the thought started, this is not just about war, there's something else going on here that is not just about those very dramatic events, or like the earthquake in Armenia that you described, which caused a great deal of trauma. But there's other aspects that are going on. And so after I'd finished there, after a number of years, I traveled in Southeast Asia and worked and volunteered in Java, in Indonesia, and in Vietnam, and in the Thai-Cambodian refugee camps at the end of the Vietnam War. And there again, I saw children who are nervous, jumpy, hypervigilant, over-controlling, startling at novelty, unable to return back to a relaxed state very often at all. And I could understand that a little bit, because they were fleeing a war, but they were not combat veterans. After my time was over there, I decided to study this more and do postgrad study. And so I set up a little counselling practice in the west of London in the UK whilst I was studying. And through the door came nervous, jumpy, hypervigilant, over-controlling children. And they looked just like the children I had been helping and supporting, just as in a small way, in Southeast Asia. And this was, you can imagine that this was quite a puzzle, because these children definitely had not been through war. But I came to think of it as the undeclared war on childhood, because what I came to understand and study was the cumulative stress of the unrelenting, fast-paced, too much, too soon, too sexy, too young, overwhelm, just simply too much in children's lives that had become the new normal. It had become ubiquitous, and it was the new normal. And our children's neurological systems were simply not able to cope with it. And so they were going into that well-known fight or flight. I would add freeze or flock to it as well, flocking being the tendency for cliques and gangs. But they were showing similar, perhaps not as acute, but very similar signs of this, because life itself had become aggressive to children's ability to actually absorb it, make meaning of it, without the fight or flight, or what Daniel Goleman, the author of Emotional Intelligence, calls amygdala hijack, and where the reptilian ancient brain really starts becoming dominant for a child. And so everything becomes hard for the child. Everything becomes hard for the tween or teen. And sure, everything becomes hard at home, because these children what their systems are saying to them is that there are invaders at the shore, but the invader is life itself. And so we very simply, it was not complicated. The thought was, well, this is cumulative. This is built up over time. No one is really spotting it because everyone else in the neighborhood or in the class are living in this way. What would happen if we cumulatively started to unstress the situation? What about if we worked in that way with parents and educators? And we began to. And what we noticed was that these children, many of them had ADD, ODD, OCD, PDD. And there were no shortage of Ds, many Ds. Ds are always waiting. Our tendency to pathologize children, I feel, sometimes is just a protective gesture, because if we pathologize them, then we don't have to change anything. Yeah. We'll just say they've got ADD, and here's the here's the medication and so on. Because if we don't pathologize, then we actually have to do something, and that's harder rather than take a pill. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's, that medications are bad or evil or whatever, but what I started noticing, and later on we studied very rigorously, academically studying, is that as these children with diagnoses or children whose behavior was problematic, and it would have ended up as a diagnosis, when we simplified and balanced their lives, they went from that disorder or disturbance of behavior to being just quirky. All children have got their quirks. It makes them lovable and actually infuriating sometimes, but that's their quirk. And so many parents said to me, I feel like I've got my little child back. I feel like I've got my teenager back. And all we had to do was just dial it back, dial their pace of life back. That's amazing, kind of thing. And they said, well, what happens if we keep doing this? I've got to confess, at the time, I said, I'm not sure. Do you want to find out? Let's just keep life at a slower pace. Well, I wonder what'll happen. And what we found was something very moving. And to this day, 30 years later, tens of thousands of children later, it still moves me every single time, is that it's not that when we dial life back, they just become their quirky little selves again. It's actually as we continue to balance, just simply balance a life. It's not radical. This is by no means radical, but just question the pace of life, make some decisions and balance. What happens is these kids' gifts start emerging. Their genius even starts emerging, because the brain now can release the frontal lobes. The brain can now, the whole neurological system, the nervous system can now move into that more executive functioning. And so the very same thing that was the quirk, the child who was just a busy child, for example, cumulative stress tipped them into never being able to sit still, not paying attention, checking out, or even then further into what's called ADHD, which I think is such a silly name. It's not attention deficit, it's actually attention excess. It's a silly name. But but that child's quirk is just they're busy, but their genius is that they're movers and shakers, and now they can time their actions appropriately. They can time their comments with an awareness of people around them, because their frontal lobes, their neocortex, their sense of safety and security is in place. And these are amazing kids. They're the kids we're going to need in the world. We don't need to be drugging them. We need to dial their lives back and release their gifts.
Yeah, I love that you used the word quirks. And yeah, the cumulative stress, the toxic stress can push anyone to their limits, right? The stress response gets overactivated, and those quirks become disorders or diseases or bad things. But yeah, I completely agree. When we dial back, simplify, create space for the kids to have thoughts and emotions, to process their days. Before the pandemic, it was a lot of families. One particular family comes to mind. It's kind of a funny story. I always wanted to share this story with you. One family I was working with, they were very busy. They had two children. The boy was 4 years old, the older child. Lots of activities, overscheduled life, typical, right? Typical Western modern life. And when he was exhibiting lots of quote unquote behavioral issues because of what you're describing. And when we were trying to simplify his life and see what's happening, I said, it looks like you don't even have downtime in your day or in your week. And then I described what the downtime means and how beneficial it could be for this little boy and things like that. And then she looked at me and she said, that sounds wonderful, Anna. So what activities do you recommend for us to do during downtime? Oh, I always remember that. I'm like, wow, people are so trained. They can never let this lifestyle, this They can never get off this train. They need always activities. It's like, can we just do nothing?
Well, it's really, as you might remember, Anna, from some of my writing and such, that I talk about giving children the gift of boredom, and just allowing them to be bored. If you've got a couple of kids, you separate them for 20 minutes or so, because they'll just start niggling each other. But just give children a chance to not have activities, to just mooch around. If my children ever came to me and said, "We've got nothing to do," I would say to them, "Oh, you know what? Something to do is just around the corner." Oh, okay. And they would go in, when they were little, they would go and look for it. and they would find it, and they'd come back saying, "Daddy, it's true. There was something to do. There was." And so, then creative activity would burst out, and they would be engaged for hours and hours on making a new game out of some cardboard boxes they'd found, or all the different things that kids can do. And it's interesting, because the present data here in the United States from the Labor Department is that by 2030, over 65% of all employment will be self-employment, will be project-based, have no benefits, medical and so on, retirement benefits, and it will be largely, as I mentioned, self-employed. Now, the reason I mention this in relationship to boredom and in relationship to children is that when children are bored, and then they find something to do, that first of all creates this kind of inner activity, so they're not relying on someone to do something for them. Now, anyone who's listening to this podcast knows that's the definition of self-employment. That you have to find your own way forward. No one is going to do it for you. And so when we allow children boredom, when we allow children decompression time, and they find something to do, what they're doing is myelinating parts of their brain, laying down neural pathways, developing social, emotional skills that are exactly the skills that are going to be needed when they grow up. For example, when children play and interact and invent, they're being intuitive, they're being inventive, they are being creative. When they're building a fort outside or whatever, and it's not working and it falls over, if they climb up the ladder and to get to the tree, and they have to problem solve, they have to have basically grit and determination. All those things are not ephemeral. They don't go away. That's laying down, that's pre-paving. That's laying down neural pathways that are absolutely going to be needed when and now it's only in 9 years' time, but 9, 10, 11, or maybe 20 years' time, depends how old your kids are. But those skills are absolutely the skills of the future. Passively watching someone else's creativity on a screen and that's what we've got to understand, that screens are fine, they're okay. I'm not particularly anti-screen, but I am passionately pro-connection. Children connecting, children playing, learning, connecting, because they're the skills that are going to be needed in the future. If we set children up with a bunch of, as you were mentioning, Anna, activities, that is us setting up activities that are external, right? That means mum and dad or teacher or coach, whoever it is going to set stuff up for you. And then you do it for a while until you're bored with it. And then you go back and say, what's next? And the mother thinks, oh, we've got to have another activity. I've got to edutain, my children, and comes up with another activity and another activity. Well, that's exactly the skills that are not needed in the future, because that's relying on someone else, as opposed to raising children who are problem solvers, who are go-getters, and who can come up with stuff, ideas, action the idea, problem solve when the idea doesn't work out, and really make it real. That is the skill of the future. And yet so many of us feel that we've got to get our kids into every class possible. Well, that's exactly the passivity that kids will not need in the future. We put iPads and phones in front of them and they can play. That's watching someone else's creativity. That's why, I don't know if you know this, Anna, but Steve Jobs did not have screens for his own kids.
Many of these execs of social media creators, all those people, they are against screens, or they at least introduce their children screens later after teenage years. But, I just want to make a couple of comments. I'm just, I'm so itching to say a couple of things. I completely agree. Of course, I love your work and resonate with that. Here is, we're trained, if they have too many activities, overscheduled lives from a younger age, as young as 3, they're overbooked and overscheduled. Let's say pre-pandemic life, right? Now it's a little different. What we're training those kids is how to survive in high pressure, high stress environment, which is completely unhealthy, and how to hate jobs that they end up having later because they didn't develop those innovative, creative parts of themselves. They end up in them working in 9 to 5 or in companies, and they hate their jobs. Why? Because this is what they're trained for, to go and always do something. Someone else has to tell you what to do, and you go and perform without listening to yourself, without expressing yourself. Number one, and that stress environment is not good. Training our kids early on to that level of stress. Yes, of course, kids are going to soccer, to this, to that, but what's the cost? How is it affecting them in the long run? I was walking with my daughter not long ago. I live in New Jersey, and we have a lot of snow now. The first time it snowed this year, I said, let's go for a walk. It's pandemic, remote learning. She doesn't have motivation to go outside to do any activity. So I push her to go outside. And she's just walking with me. I'm bored. I want to go home. I hate this. She starts complaining. And of course, I'm not responding. I'm not arguing or saying, no, you have to enjoy this. I'm just walking with her. And then I'm like, wow, she's not even engaging with the snow or not even having fun. Then I made a snowball and I said, I can throw this snowball. Can you throw and see whose snowball can go further? And she's like, yeah. I said, yeah. So I had to initiate this game of who can throw the snowball further. And she got so involved in it. And I'm thinking to myself, this is terrible. I need to prompt my kid. I have to show my kid how to play as opposed to her initiating. And I noticed this trend. A lot of us parents, we need to sort of show them how to engage in play. We need to play with them just a little bit, or it's disturbing to me. And recently I read an article that, lack of free, unstructured play is what you're saying, linked to creativity. And we need the children who are going to be the problem solvers. If we need treatment for cancer, innovative, approaches to life, and with the IA and all of this, we need innovative, creative, free thinkers. And this is disturbing to me, what I see, the trend in our culture,
Well, and, one of your snowballs with your daughter, it's, well, if I may say, that's just well done, because I don't think there's in that situation or in others that there's anything excuse me, inherently wrong with beginning our children's play, like drawing them into play, because many children these days do need drawing into play because of, this life, because of what's happening, because of particularly what's happening at school, where they sit for hours just being drilled. And the fact that you did that and you drew her into play and then she was engaged in it. And then the next step often I find is that when we can draw children into play and then they play, and then we, if we possibly can, we move from from a play initiator to then parallel playing. So let's say it's with a little child and we get them playing, and then we might just parallel, like we might just build our own little garage for the trucks or put the dolly to our own bed. So now we parallel beside them, and then we sit back on the sofa and now we're a play presence. So we're not playing anymore, but we're present. And then from play paralleling play to being a play presence, then we can be proximal to play. Then, in other words, we can go to the kitchen and get on with cleaning up or get dinner preparation started. So, and then the child all this time, so very, very often, has had their play started, but then we can gradually move back, move away, and then they're into it. And the beauty of this, and this is particularly in pandemic times, but in any time actually, is that children, they play out the world. They play out the stress. I remember when my own children went to the doctors, pediatricians, who had a television on, which was kind of weird because even the American, Psychological Association recommend no screens before the age of 2. And although that's shifting and changing a little bit now, the recommendations at the time it was before the age of 2. So there was a pediatrician with the screen on with lots of little children in the room. It was weird. But anyway, my kids got home and I thought they were going to play doctors and nurses, but they actually played health security office, because it's the United States. It's all got to do with paperwork and insurances and forms, and so they wrote out forms, and they got a big cardboard box and an office, and mummy and daddy and the cat and the dog had to line up. Actually, the cat was a lost cause. They don't line up. But anyway, and we had to fill out lots of forms, and they played out what was a particularly stressful environment. And they had a television up on the wall where they put lots of drawings, and the drawings were kind of crazy. They would scribble and pull another one down and scribble and pull another one down and put another one up. And they were replicating what television meant to them with just these random scribblings, and throw another one up and pull it down and throw it up. Basically images that come, go, that you can't absorb, which is exactly what television, the fast-paced media does for children, is they can't absorb it. But they played out health security office for days and days, down into deep creative play, and they played it out. They played it out of their system. They were no longer stressed by it. Their sleep for 2 or 3 days was a little bit restless. Third day of playing this, they were good. They were back. But they had to be given time, and children need to be given time to play. And that's one of my worries about screens in general. Again, I'm not anti-screen, but I'm really pro-connection for a child to themselves, to their own needs, to their own possibilities of play and of engagement, real engagement. And, the Kaiser Family Foundation study, this was way back in 2011 when it first started becoming more based on empirical data, is that the average American 12-year-old was exposed to 7.5 hours of screens per day. Common Sense Media followed that up in 2016-17, and that had now risen to 9.25 hours a day. So that's why the New York Times wrote a very popular article saying if your child's awake, they're on a screen. Yeah. Now, if we have our children watching less screens than that, well, then well done us, because we've made a decision. if there's anyone listening to this podcast thinks, well, gosh, my kids definitely don't have 7 to 9 hours of screens a day, then I would say, well done. You've made a decision. You've limited screens for your children, and good, and long may that be the case. So in that case, the play takes time, and we don't want to rob them of that time, of that self-creativity, but also particularly in pandemic times where there's a lot of stress in the air, there's a lot going on around children. We really want to allow them more time to play now, not less, because that's where they play out their stress and can basically reset their nervous systems.
Yeah, I agree about play being so crucial in processing their day, their emotions, their life, especially the difficult events, right? And it's interesting, I hear from parents that their children now playing pandemic with masks and things of this nature. This pandemic theme is playing out in children's plays. If we don't give them time and space, and it's their attention, their time is preoccupied by screens. What I notice is, like, in the evening, my daughter has increased screen time now. In the evening, when the screens are off, because we have limits and things of that nature, she wants to enjoy life all of a sudden. She wants to chill by the fireplace. She wants to have a cup of tea. She wants to chat with us, but it's already getting late, And I'm hearing from other parents as well that because kids have so much screen time, there is not much time for other important activities that they need, that they crave. And I'm so happy that you're bringing up this processing of this pandemic even time. Screens are such an easy drug, easy avoidance tool to escape into this interesting Minecraft world or to this TikTok world, and children have not even processed, many children, what has happened, what's going on. They didn't have time to talk to other family members or to be with themselves. Oftentimes I drag my kid every day outside because she has to walk, and she says to me, I don't want to talk to you. I want to walk by myself. You walk behind me. And I'm like, thank God, because I don't want to, chit chat. And I see she's in her thoughts. She needs that. She needs that time to be with her thoughts. After 15 minutes, she comes and she starts talking to me and sharing. But I see that the importance of time and space in her life is key. And we rob them off, our children, from this precious gift of being introspective, right? In order to be with yourself, you need time and space. And if that time and space is taken by something else, it's really sad.
Well, one of the it's interesting because one of the things that's happening, and this does come via screens, is the time that a child needs to spend just with themselves, mm-hmm. and just understanding their own, I call that their own true north, as opposed to the magnetic north of popular, toxic at times, pop culture. I went to a conference recently. It was an online conference because I'd been unsuccessful in being accepted to go to the in-person conferences. Part of the problem with being, a so-called well-known author and so on is that I'd apply to this conference, which was marketing to children. And I'd apply to go because I wanted to basically, inform myself and not just have opinions. I wanted to go and see. And so I was, on this third time, I was accepted into this online environment. I think they got a little less fussy, perhaps, or they weren't checking people out, because for me, all they'd have to do was, do a web search on my name, and they would see that in television and radio and all this stuff that
yeah.
I was not their greatest fan. And But Anna, it was worth going along and giving the time and the very expensive price of the conference for just to sort of be there and hear what these folk were talking about. And there were all the big children's food, breakfast cereal companies, all the big tech companies. There were even motor car companies there. There were all the family household names that we know. They were all represented, or most of them represented. And but it was worth it just to hear only two words, is what I came away with, is that these people no longer refer to us as parents. That word, it was sometimes used, but overwhelmingly the term that is used is we are no longer called parents by marketers. We are called purchasing friction.
Oh my goodness.
That's our name.
Wow.
Purchasing friction.
Wow.
And the main theme of this conference was the removal of purchasing friction.
Oh, God.
Because that, of course, is how you have children buy. And $16 billion a year is spent on removing us from our children's lives. In other words, on breaking family. And because that's then how you buy stuff. When children are in charge, when children call the shots, that then enormously increases the possibility of selling something. And so what authentic parenting and podcasts like it are offering is in a small way, a way of coping with that onslaught of these voracious marketing forces attempting to actually break family values. And what is hopeful about it is that the $16 billion a year they spend on this, a vast majority of that spending of money is via screens. So all we need to do is to go low or no screen, and just in that one simple conscious gesture, we are then not allowing ourselves to have our family broken. And yet the irony of it is that, well, back to Steve Jobs, he didn't have screens for his own kids, but he just packaged it up in minimalistic, beautiful packaging and sold it to us poor schmucks. And we believe we have to have it. And yet it is a weapon of mass family dislocation. And what I admire about parents, so many parents these days are really questioning. For example, as you were saying, Anna, the screens have come into our lives in a big time in this pandemic. And there are some educators now, a whole bunch of them actually, who are now questioning, who they've now seen. They've tried to replicate their classes online and on Zoom, and the children spend hours and hours on Zoom. And it's what I call, we could turn ourselves into zombies, like The Walking Dead. And
I love that. Sorry.
And yeah, perhaps I shouldn't be saying that. Is that okay to say? Anyway, I don't know.
It's okay, yes.
Is it okay? Good. But the many educators now are saying, we're going to send downloadables, print them out, and then we're going to go onto Zoom, but we'll go audio only. And then we'll switch our cameras on for short periods of time, and then back to the printable, the printouts, and back to audio. Many educators are doing this now, and it's being very much welcomed by parents. The other way around is some parents are agitating for this now, asking for less screen time, more downloadables, more audio only. Part of my thinking, and a lot of parents who I speak with on a day-to-day basis in my private practice are saying, you know what, we need to get back to having a lower screen environment, and we're already making plans. We're already talking to our children about, we've had so much screens, haven't we, during this stay-at-home time? But soon we're going to be able to get back and play with our friends and hang out with our people, and just heads up that we are going to be starting to get this back in shape again. Because my worry, and a lot of parents are now sharing this concern, is that we've set a certain level of hours of screen time exposure, and that our kids will want to continue with that because of the large dumping of dopamine that screens bring, particularly gaming, social networking to some extent, but screens are designed, particularly gaming is designed for large excretions of dumping of dopamine, which, is many of us know, is the pleasure and reward hormone. And very, very similar to almost, you almost can't tell the difference in brain imaging from a child who's been gaming for an hour or two and someone under the influence of cocaine. It's very, very, very similar. And parents are now starting to, and I really admire this, think forward a little bit to say, how do we get our shape back? In the late spring and summer here in the northern hemisphere, at least, in the autumn in the southern hemisphere, how do we get our shape back and dial back and start to dial up? For example, under the walk that you're doing with your daughter, you're keeping that connection to nature, you're keeping that connection with her, and because you're keeping that alive, there's every chance that you can just start doing a little more of that, a little less of screens, and you're back. And my recommendation to any parent now is to start thinking about 3 to 4 to 6 months down the track and already start staging an increase in connection of, I don't know, like family game nights of board games that you play in the evening for little children. Having them play more away from screens in that principle I talked about of beginning, then paralleling, then, being a presence, and then being proximal. Build up the amount of time they spend away from screens as these months go on, so that when we're back again, it won't be a jolt, chemically, literally, it won't be a jolt to their system if we try to limit it, because then we'll get a lot of pushback.
Oh boy, outbursts and explosive behaviors. We know some, a category of children, not all children react the same way, but some kids, when you take the drug away, it's impossible. I do love this idea of weaning down slowly and introducing the idea that our life is going to be different. And I've been talking to my daughter, but I'm going to make a more conscious effort to, now that I'm listening to you, I'm like, wow, this is brilliant, to sort of prepare all of us to slowly, this is not going to be our normal. This is just enjoy the ride as long as it lasts. But it's funny, you mentioned about the schools going audio and, downloadables. I just had a conversation yesterday with my daughter's teacher, and I said, could you please email me the homework and all the work, and I'll print it, because this is impossible. It's hard to do it online. And she said yes. And I wish many educators will implement, because this was new, right, for everyone. And I'm not criticizing the education system, but it sounds like my school district, at least, and my school district is notorious that there have been articles written about our school district in the New York Times that it's the most high achieving, high performing, high stress, high expectation environment. So I am in this school district, and it seems like the school is just functioning as the pandemic hasn't even happened. And I've been having conversations and arguments with teachers that we need to readjust here. It's the mental health that is at stake. And it's not the academics that you need to push. And functioning in the way that they do, it's just, I love hearing all the stories that you shared with me of the innovative ways that your wife's school or those other educators have implemented. It gives me so much hope, and I hope it will inspire others across the country, across the world, to rethink how learning has to be delivered. My daughter is learning to hate learning through this medium. And I mean, I don't even want to open the can of worms regarding, remote learning and the Zoom and all of that. But yeah.
So one of the things you just mentioned, Anna, is I think we could do a little more of in general, and that is you approached an educator. And you see, I have one foot in the education world. I work with schools on a program I bring called Healthy School Culture, which is all about emotional, behavioral, and social support to children who need extra support in those realms. And underpinning it all is something I call social inclusion. So I'm in schools pretty much daily, even during pandemic time. I'm working with people online. And so one foot in that world. And what I hear from the teachers is that they're also uncomfortable with Zoom, but they are feeling pressure from administration, and particularly pressure from some quarters of parents who who are worried that their children will fall so-called behind, right?
Yeah.
The interest in that is behind what? I mean, the whole world is in this situation. There's no behind. But anyway, the teachers from their side of things are experiencing pressure from, I would say, just a relatively large minority, but it is a vocal minority of parents who want the kids to spend hours on, they don't want the kids to spend hours on screens, but they want the academic pace to continue. All right.
Yes.
And there's other parents who have just opted out. They're at the other end of it who just said, no, I'm not doing this. And homeschooling has just exploded. But then there's a group of parents in the middle, and perhaps, Anna, you're one of them. I'm not sure.
I'll tell you which one I am. I'll tell you in a moment.
But you're hanging in there. Your daughter's still in the school. And when parents approach a teacher and say, look, can we please download the homeworks and make that downloadables? Is it okay that can I have permission for my daughter to go off camera and just pop the laptop screen down a little bit and just continue on and have audio? Most teachers that I speak with will respond positively to that, but they won't do it right out loud because they will anger the very vocal parents who want the fast pace to continue. But my recommendation has been to many, many of the parents I speak with on a weekly basis is approach your teachers, approach them in a spirit of we, not you, and approach them like we are in this situation together. It would really help my daughter, not wanting to give them educational advice and telling them how to do their job, but just speaking about your own child. What would help? Is it possible? Can we make a plan? Because most of the time it doesn't involve the teacher doing any extra work whatsoever. They're already maxed out. They've been going flat out since March. Very few teachers had a summer vacation. They were working. And they're pretty maxed out. But a call like yours to a parent, to a teacher from a parent, is usually welcomed if it's framed in a spirit of, how can we work this out together? I want my daughter to have maximum learning, to recover a little bit, love learning again, be open to it. Here's some ideas. What do you think? And it's a brief conversation, but a problem-solving one. Most parents I'm speaking with that I advise, and there's in my podcast, which I know you mentioned, Anna, earlier, I think there's 2 or 3 podcasts in how to have successful conversations with teachers. It's going well. I hope it went well for you. Did it go okay?
It did go well. I spoke with one teacher, and she was very receptive and understanding. I am, action-driven. I have an education degree. I've worked in the education system. Like you said, I have one foot in the education department. My thinking is, I convinced my husband to do homeschooling. I am pro homeschooling. I was always against formal education, but now more than ever, I'm convinced, I want to do the homeschooling. However, my daughter is adamantly against it, and I can't force her. I can't make her, and that's the struggle I have. That's where I am. In which camp you said I was? I'm in that camp. It took a bit of convincing to do to my husband, and he shares with me completely. He understands, but our kid doesn't want to. Here is another thing I would say. As I mentioned that I'm near Princeton University, and our school district is known for this high performance, high achiever. The parents are really, really pushing for it. And what I've heard from some of the parents, they're not like me. They put surveillance cameras in their children's bedroom because they're working parents. They can't be like me. I work from home. I can go and check on my kid. They can't. They have full-time jobs. They have a camera to keep an eye on their kid. If the kid moves, the threat system is activated. The cortisol is in that child to be on the Zoom and perform and learn and study. And, I can tell you, I work with parents, hitting, yelling, all those measures have increased in people's households because parents want to keep their child engaged in this virtual learning. It's, I see some of those negative aspects, and it's just so upsetting and disturbing. If the parent has to go to that extreme to put a camera to keep the kid in school, what are we doing to our kids' nervous system?
Yeah. And I think, earlier I mentioned this very dark image of there is an undeclared war on childhood going on. And I know we're coming to the end of our time together for our conversation today, but just in rounding off, one of the things that I want to put forward is that, in this undeclared war on childhood, when we think about war, it's so out of our control. There are things happening around the world in these war-torn places, and we hear about them, and it's heartbreaking, really. And it's so out of our control. We can take some steps, but just even in your home country of Armenia, all the disturbances actually more recently, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And that have been happening, and the war there. And so little we can do. We can try, but in our homes, we can declare peace. We absolutely can declare peace for family life. And it's very doable, it's very possible, and it's utterly joyful to do it. And one can feel effective. You see your children growing up in a way that is, what you always hoped, good days, bad days, of course, but we can declare peace in our homes.
So thank you so much. Thank you so much for your calm presence, for your deep wisdom. I so appreciate your generosity, sharing this time with me. I really valued this conversation a lot. I'll be thinking about the things you said, and all the best to you in your work. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart.
Oh, and to you, Anna, and anyone who is tuning in to this podcast. Many blessings.
Yeah, thank you.